In the summer of 1944, the German Eastern Front reached its breaking point. Army Group Center, the Wehrmacht's most powerful formation on Soviet soil, had been holding defensive lines across Belarus since the autumn of 1943. These positions, stretching from Vitebsk in the north through Orsha and Mogilev to Bobruisk in the south, formed the backbone of German control over occupied Belarus. By June, this defensive belt was manned by over 800,000 troops, supported by approximately 9,500 artillery pieces, 900 tanks and assault guns, and 1,350 aircraft. Despite this concentration, the German positions were vulnerable. Extended supply lines, the loss of air superiority, and the inability to replace casualties. Its objective was the destruction of Army Group Center, not simply pushing it back. The Red Army, under the coordination of the Soviet Supreme High Command, Stavka, assembled 4 fronts for the operation: the 1st Baltic Front, the 1st Belarusian Front, and the 2nd and 3rd Belarusian Fronts. Together, they fielded 2.3 million men, supported by 36,400 artillery pieces, 5,200 tanks and self-propelled guns, and nearly 5,300 aircraft. The German High Command, despite intelligence reports and partisan activity suggesting preparations for a Soviet offensive, miscalculated both the scale and the direction of the assault. German planners assumed that the Red Army would prioritize operations in Ukraine or along the Baltic, aiming toward East Prussia. Consequently, Hitler insisted that Army Group Center hold its positions in Belarus and declared major cities such as Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, and Bobruisk as fortresses to be defended at all costs. This rigid approach ignored the reality that these static positions could be outflanked and cut off by Soviet mechanized thrusts. The context of the battle for Minsk lies in the catastrophic series of encirclements that preceded it. In the north, Soviet forces smashed through at Vitebsk, encircling and destroying 5 German divisions within days. At Orsha, the German 3rd Panzer Army collapsed under the weight of concentrated artillery and armored assaults. Further south, at Bobruisk, the 9th Army was trapped in a massive pocket and suffered devastating losses. By the last week of June, Army Group Center had already lost over 200,000 men and vast quantities of equipment. The German line was in ruins, and the way to Minsk lay open. Minsk, the capital of Belarus, held immense strategic importance. It was the logistical hub of Army Group Center, with rail lines radiating toward Warsaw, Vilnius, and Smolensk. For the Soviets, its capture promised to sever German communications, cut off retreating forces, and open the road to Poland. For the Germans, holding Minsk meant preserving a chance to regroup, restore lines of communication, and shield East Prussia and the Reich's borders from immediate Soviet advance. By late June, the Soviet High Command issued direct orders to encircle Minsk. The 1st Belarusian Front, under General Konstantin Rokossovsky, advanced from the south, while the 3rd Belarusian Front, commanded by General Ivan Chernyakhovsky, advanced from the north. Their spearheads aimed to meet west of Minsk, trapping the remnants of Army Group Center. The 2nd Belarusian Front pressed through Mogilev, preventing the German 4th Army from escaping. To ensure the success of the encirclement, Soviet tank armies and mechanized corps were deployed to drive deep into the German rear, cutting railways and highways before defenders could retreat. The German command recognized the danger, but was constrained by Hitler's no-retreat orders. Field Marshal Ernst Busch, commander of Army Group Center, repeatedly requested permission to withdraw behind the Berezina River and establish a new defensive line. Hitler rejected these appeals, insisting that fortress cities must hold. By the time the German High Command replaced Busch with Field Marshal Walter Model on 28 June, the situation was beyond repair. Soviet breakthroughs had already shattered the coherence of the German front, and Model inherited an army on the verge of collapse. The preconditions for the encirclement at Minsk were thus set by a combination of Soviet operational strength, German strategic miscalculations, and the inflexible policies of Hitler's leadership. The destruction of German forces at Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, and Bobruisk had already paved the way. What remained was the decisive Soviet push to close the trap around Minsk itself, an operation that would annihilate the core of Army Group Center and alter the strategic balance of the war in the east. The opening phase of the battle for Minsk began in the last days of June 1944, when the Red Army's rapid advances from multiple directions converged on the approaches to the Belarusian capital. Having shattered German defenses at Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, and Bobruisk, Soviet formations pressed forward relentlessly, determined not to allow the remnants of Army Group Center to regroup. The German High Command, already stunned by the scale of Operation Bagration, struggled to issue coherent orders as Soviet forces advanced at unprecedented speed. From the north, General Ivan Chernyakhovsky's 3rd Belarusian Front broke through German positions after the collapse of the 3rd Panzer Army. Spearheaded by the 5th Guards Tank Army and supported by the 11th Guards Army, Soviet columns surged toward the Berezina River, bypassing scattered pockets of German resistance and leaving them to infantry units to reduce. On the southern flank, Konstantin Rokossovsky's 1st Belarusian Front exploited the destruction of the German 9th Army at Bobruisk. Mechanized corps and cavalry formations drove rapidly northwest, seizing key crossings and road junctions, cutting the lines of retreat for German troops falling back from the Dnieper. In the center, the 2nd Belarusian Front under General Georgy Zakharov pressed westward through Mogilev, pursuing the remnants of the German 4th Army. Having captured the city after heavy fighting on 28 to 29 June, Soviet forces poured through the gap, preventing the enemy from establishing defensive positions along the Berezina. By the evening of 30th June, the Soviet fronts had advanced up to 120 kilometers in some sectors, threatening to envelop Minsk from the north, south, and east simultaneously. The German situation deteriorated with each passing day. Communications between divisions were disorganized, and many units retreated without orders, abandoning heavy equipment in the face of Soviet armored breakthroughs. Army Group Center attempted to re-establish a line along the Berezina River, but Soviet bridgeheads were established almost as soon as German units arrived. Luftwaffe support was minimal, as Soviet air forces dominated the skies with more than 2,000 sorties daily, bombing columns, bridges, and supply depots. Within Minsk, preparations for defense were chaotic. German commanders attempted to organize a garrison from supply units, training battalions, and scattered remnants of shattered divisions. Estimates suggest that around 100,000 to 120,000 German soldiers converged on the Minsk sector by early July, hoping to regroup or retreat westward. However, the rapid Soviet advance made these efforts futile. Reinforcements from the rear were unavailable, as the bulk of Germany's reserves were tied down in France following the Allied landings in Normandy. Soviet High Command seized the initiative to close the encirclement. On 1st July, armored spearheads from the 3rd Belarusian Front crossed the Berezina north of Minsk, cutting the road to Vilnius. At the same time, Rokossovsky's forces advanced through Stolpci and Baranovichi, severing the southern approaches. By 2nd July, Soviet mobile groups were racing west of Minsk, seeking to link up and complete the encirclement. The German retreat routes narrowed to a few contested corridors, under constant bombardment from Soviet artillery and aircraft. Units reported severe shortages of ammunition and fuel, and retreating formations were harassed constantly by Soviet partisans who blew up bridges and ambushed columns in forests. Prisoner interrogations later revealed that many German soldiers no longer believed they could hold Minsk, but clung to the hope of breaking westward to join formations retreating from Vilnius or Baranovichi. The opening phase thus concluded with Soviet forces closing around Minsk from 3 directions, while German forces, numbering more than 20 divisions in various states of disintegration, found themselves trapped. The stage was set for one of the largest encirclements of the Eastern Front, where the fate of Army Group Center would be sealed in the fields and forests surrounding the Belarusian capital. As the Red Army's armored spearheads converged on Minsk in the first days of July 1944, the operation transitioned into its decisive planning phase. Stavka's orders left little ambiguity. The city was not simply to be taken, but to become the focal point of a vast encirclement designed to annihilate what remained of Army Group Center. The Soviet General Staff calculated that the German 4th and 9th Armies, as well as large elements of the 3rd Panzer Army, were retreating westward into the Minsk sector. Their destruction would not only open the road to Vilnius and Warsaw, but also cripple Germany's ability to restore a coherent defensive line in the east. The Soviet plan relied on the coordination of three major fronts. General Ivan Chernyakhovsky's 3rd Belarusian Front was tasked with driving from the north, cutting the Minsk-Vilnius highway and rail lines. The 1st Belarusian Front, under Konstantin Rokossovsky, advanced from the south and southwest, blocking routes to Baranovichi and Brest. Meanwhile, Georgy Zakharov's 2nd Belarusian Front pressed through Mogilev from the east, preventing the 4th Army from retreating in good order. Together, these movements formed the jaws of a massive pincer that would close west of Minsk. To ensure speed and penetration, mobile formations, the 5th Guards Tank Army, the 2nd Guards Tank Corps, and cavalry mechanized groups were thrown into the lead, with rifle armies following to clear pockets of resistance. The objectives were clear, but the operation demanded extraordinary logistical preparation. Soviet supply columns stretched for kilometers across newly liberated territory. Engineers repaired bridges, rebuilt railway spurs, and laid pontoon crossings across the Berezina under heavy enemy fire. The ability to move fuel and ammunition forward at such a pace marked a significant development in Soviet operational art, a stark contrast to the shortages and breakdowns of 1941. Soviet artillery, concentrated in massive groupings, was shifted forward to provide continuous barrages, while the 16th and 1st Air Armies coordinated bombing runs to prevent German columns from reforming. On the German side, the planning process was marked by denial and miscalculation. Hitler's directives remained rigid. Minsk was to be held as a fortress, defended to the last man. This order, issued despite the collapse of preceding defensive lines, forced German commanders to prepare the city for defense even as their armies streamed westward in disarray. Field Marshal Walter Model, who replaced Ernst Busch as commander of Army Group Center on 28 June, recognized the hopelessness of the situation but had little freedom of action. Model, known as the fireman of the Eastern Front for his skill in crisis management, attempted to organize breakout corridors west of Minsk, yet his forces were too depleted to execute such maneuvers effectively. The remnants of the German 4th Army, under General Kurt von Tippelskirch, were particularly vulnerable. Having suffered catastrophic losses in the battles for Mogilev and the Dnieper crossings, the army retreated toward Minsk with less than half its original strength. Some divisions were reduced to battalion-sized groups. Artillery parks contained more guns than there were crews to man them. Similarly, the 9th Army, shattered at Bobruisk, streamed northward in a disorderly mass, clogging roads with vehicles, horse-drawn wagons, and columns of exhausted infantry. German reports described traffic jams of unprecedented scale, with retreating units and fleeing civilians competing for space on narrow roads while under constant attack from Soviet aircraft. German attempts to reinforce Minsk were minimal. Reserve formations were unavailable, as most had already been committed to other collapsing sectors of the front or tied down in Western Europe following the Allied landings in Luftwaffe support was equally insufficient. Fuel shortages and Soviet air superiority limited sorties to small numbers of reconnaissance flights and harassment missions. By contrast, the Soviet air forces conducted more than 4,500 sorties in the first days of July alone, bombing bridges, strafing convoys, and isolating German strongpoints. Propaganda played a dual role during this stage. German broadcasts insisted that Minsk would hold, comparing it to earlier fortress defenses at Sevastopol or Kharkov. Orders circulated within the Wehrmacht repeated Hitler's directive that surrender was forbidden. Yet morale among the rank and file crumbled as soldiers witnessed the destruction of entire formations. Letters and diaries later recovered reveal a prevailing sense of abandonment, with soldiers questioning why they were ordered to hold a city already doomed by encirclement. Soviet radio announced the liberation of towns daily, portraying the offensive as a cascade of victories. The promise of liberating Minsk carried symbolic weight, as the city had been under occupation since June 1941 and was a key administrative hub for German authorities in Belarus. Partisan detachments operating in the surrounding forests were instructed to intensify sabotage against retreating German forces, cutting telegraph lines, ambushing columns, and destroying bridges to hasten the collapse. Despite their exhaustion, Soviet troops pressed forward with determination. Rifle divisions advanced in close coordination with tank units, ensuring that German rearguards could not establish delaying lines. Cavalry mechanized groups, exploiting gaps, bypassed German positions to strike deeper into the rear, while artillery and rocket units bombarded Minsk itself to soften resistance. By 1st July, Soviet spearheads had reached the outskirts of the city, while mobile forces maneuvered to close the encirclement from the west. The planning and execution of the encirclement operation thus revealed a stark contrast. On one side, the Red Army applied overwhelming force, flexible maneuver, and integrated arms to achieve operational depth. On the other, the German High Command clung to rigid orders that prevented rational withdrawal, turning Minsk into a trap for its own forces. The convergence of these factors ensured that the battle for Minsk would not be a prolonged siege, but a rapid and catastrophic encirclement, the outcome of which was already foreshadowed before the first Soviet troops entered the city's streets. The first clashes around Minsk erupted on 1st July 1944, as Soviet spearheads closed on the city from multiple directions. The Third Belarusian Front advanced from the northeast. Rokossovsky's First Belarusian Front, driving from the south, captured Stolpci and Baranovichi, effectively severing the rail link to Brest. At the same time, the Second Belarusian Front pressed from the east, pushing retreating elements of the German Fourth Army back against the growing encirclement. German units caught in this tightening ring attempted to establish delaying positions. Elements of the 31st, 25th, and 78th Infantry Divisions dug in along defensive belts east of Minsk, hoping to slow the Soviet advance. In practice, their efforts amounted to scattered rearguard actions. Soviet artillery barrages, followed by coordinated infantry and tank assaults, smashed through hastily prepared trenches and strongpoints. Local counterattacks, often led by scratch Kampfgruppen of survivors from shattered divisions, could inflict casualties but lacked the strength to hold ground. The civilian population of Minsk endured bombardments as Soviet aircraft struck rail stations, supply depots, and troop concentrations within the city. Eyewitness accounts describe fires raging through industrial districts, warehouses, and residential blocks. German authorities forced civilians to assist in building barricades, while police units carried out hurried deportations of prisoners and forced laborers westward. Many could not escape before the encirclement tightened, leaving tens of thousands trapped in the city as the fighting approached. Soviet reconnaissance units probed the outer defenses on the evening of 1st July, meeting scattered resistance in villages and forests around the city. By the morning of 2nd July, Red Army formations had advanced within artillery range of Minsk from the east and south. The Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army, moving rapidly through captured crossings north of the city, cut the Minsk-Molodechno Railway, sealing off the last major supply line. At the same time, cavalry mechanized groups swept west of Minsk, aiming to complete the encirclement by linking with Rokossovsky's advancing forces. German communications were increasingly chaotic. Headquarters reports spoke of divisions reduced to remnants of 2,000 men, lacking artillery, and with only a handful of tanks or assault guns. The remnants of the Fourth Army attempted to regroup west of Minsk, but Soviet pressure prevented any organized withdrawal. Orders to hold the city at all costs meant that thousands of exhausted soldiers were forced into static defenses, condemned to face overwhelming Soviet firepower. By the evening of 2nd July, Soviet forces had entered Minsk's eastern suburbs. German rearguards fought bitterly in fortified houses, factories, and along road junctions, but their efforts could only delay the inevitable. The encirclement was nearly complete. For the defenders, the first engagements around Minsk made clear that their position was untenable. For the Red Army, these clashes marked the opening of the final act: the destruction of Army Group Center's core in the fields, forests, and streets of Belarus's capital. By 2nd July 1944, the battle for Minsk escalated into full crisis for the German Army Group Center. Soviet armored spearheads, supported by mechanized corps and mobile cavalry groups, pushed deep into the German rear, cutting the final escape corridors. The 5th Guards Tank Army advanced swiftly from the northeast, reaching the Molodechno Road and sealing the northern approaches. At the same time, the 2nd Guards Tank Corps and Rokossovsky's southern group seized Stolpci and continued westward, severing the last rail connections to Brest. The jaws of the encirclement were closing with remarkable speed, trapping tens of thousands of German soldiers in and around Minsk. German rearguard actions attempted to stall the Soviet advance. Kampfgruppen formed from remnants of shattered divisions fought along major highways and river crossings, employing anti-tank guns and hastily emplaced field fortifications. Yet Soviet forces brought overwhelming artillery and armor to bear. Concentrations of up to 200 guns per kilometer reduced German defensive lines to ruins before infantry and tanks advanced. In several sectors, entire German battalions were wiped out in hours, their positions encircled and overrun. Soviet reports note that resistance was determined but fragmented, with no coherent front line by the evening of 2nd July. Within Minsk itself, German command sought to organize a defensive perimeter. Police units, rear echelon troops, and fragments of retreating divisions were thrown into barricades along main streets and around administrative centers. Barricades of rubble, trams, and sandbags appeared, but there were few heavy weapons left to support them. The civilian population, already exhausted by 3 years of occupation, was forced to dig trenches, carry ammunition, and assist in fortifying public buildings. Bombardments set entire districts on fire, creating panic among residents. Tens of thousands fled into surrounding forests, hoping to avoid being caught in the encirclement. Soviet air supremacy further deepened the crisis. Bombing raids struck bridges over the Svislach and roads leading west, ensuring that German attempts at withdrawal were continuously harassed. Columns of vehicles caught on open roads were destroyed by strafing runs, their burned-out remains blocking the retreat of infantry and horse-drawn carts. Fuel shortages crippled the few remaining armored vehicles, leaving them abandoned along highways or destroyed by their own crews. The casualties mounted rapidly. Soviet estimates suggest that in the first 2 days of July alone, over 20,000 German troops were killed or captured in the Minsk sector. Entire regiments surrendered after running out of ammunition, while others disintegrated into small groups attempting to escape through forests. By the evening of 2nd July, it was clear that more than 100,000 German soldiers were trapped in what was becoming the Minsk pocket. For the Red Army, the escalation of the battle confirmed the effectiveness of its operational planning. Soviet fronts moved in coordination, preventing German breakouts and exploiting their superiority in armor, artillery, and air power. Infantry divisions pressed directly into Minsk, while mobile groups sealed the encirclement to the west. For the Wehrmacht, the escalation marked the irreversible collapse of Army Group Center's central sector. Attempts to regroup or stabilize the front failed, leaving only isolated strongpoints and rearguards resisting in the face of overwhelming Soviet pressure. By the night of Tuesday, the once vital hub of German communications and logistics had become the site of one of the largest encirclements on the Eastern Front, with tens of thousands of troops trapped inside. The crisis was complete. The next stage would determine whether these forces could break out or whether they would be destroyed in place, adding to the already catastrophic losses of Operation Bagration. On 3rd July 1944, the battle for Minsk reached its peak. At dawn, Soviet troops of the Third Belarusian Front pressed into the eastern and northern suburbs, while the First Belarusian Front entered from the south. By this time, the encirclement had been completed. German formations inside the pocket, numbering approximately 100,000 to 120,000 men from more than 20 divisions, were cut off from all organized retreat routes. The German Fourth Army, remnants of the Ninth Army, and elements of the Third Panzer Army were trapped, with no hope of significant. Inside the city, the German command attempted to stage a defense, but the effort lacked coherence. Forces available to hold Minsk consisted of rear area units, police detachments, Luftwaffe ground crews, and remnants of divisions retreating from Mogilev and Bobruisk. Heavy weapons were scarce. In many sectors, defenders relied on machine guns and small arms. Improvised barricades of carts, rubble, and felled trees appeared along major streets, but without artillery or armor in significant numbers, the German defenders could not hope to withstand the concentrated assaults of the Red Army. The Soviet attack was characterized by overwhelming coordination. Infantry advanced street by street, supported by artillery firing directly at fortified buildings and by tanks clearing intersections. In some districts, Soviet Katyusha rocket batteries saturated entire blocks before rifle battalions advanced. Engineers with flamethrowers and explosives cleared bunkers and cellars, often reducing entire structures to rubble. Soviet reports describe advancing no more than 100-200 meters per hour in certain sectors due to stubborn resistance, but the overall momentum remained firmly in their favor. Civilian suffering during this phase was immense. Fires consumed entire districts, spreading from artillery strikes and demolitions. Residents hiding in basements faced both bombardment and the danger of suffocation from smoke and collapsing buildings. Many were caught in crossfire as Soviet troops advanced and German soldiers fought from residential houses. Some civilians attempted to flee west with retreating columns but found themselves trapped when Soviet armored units cut the highways. Others took refuge in ruins until the fighting subsided. The largest German defensive efforts were concentrated around the railway station, the city center, and the western exits of Minsk, where commanders hoped to keep corridors open for breakout attempts. Fighting was fiercest on the approaches to these areas, where German infantry and anti-tank guns temporarily delayed Soviet advances. In one sector, elements of the 78th Infantry Division managed to repel several Soviet assaults with concentrated machine gun fire before being encircled and destroyed by evening. By midday on 3rd July, Soviet flags were raised over several central buildings, and reports reached Moscow that Minsk had fallen. Stalin immediately issued an order of the day, declaring the liberation of the Belarusian capital. For the Red Army, the capture of Minsk was both a symbolic victory and a strategic achievement, marking the destruction of German defenses in central Belarus. The news was broadcast widely, and celebratory artillery salutes were fired in Moscow that, despite the loss of the city, fighting continued in the surrounding forests and fields. Encircled German forces attempted to break westward in small groups, abandoning heavy weapons and vehicles. Columns of infantry, sometimes numbering several thousand, tried to reach the Berezina but were intercepted by Soviet tanks, cavalry, and partisans. Casualties mounted rapidly. Soviet sources estimate that between 3 and 6 July, more than 70,000 German soldiers were captured in the Minsk pocket, with tens of thousands killed in battle. The destruction of Army Group Center's corps was now undeniable. The peak of the campaign was thus defined by both the ferocity of the fighting inside Minsk and the scale of the encirclement outside it. German formations, ordered to hold a fortress city without sufficient resources, were destroyed in detail. Soviet forces, executing their plans with precision, secured one of the greatest operational victories of the war. The battlefield around Minsk was left littered with abandoned equipment, burning wrecks, and columns of prisoners, testimony to the magnitude of the collapse. For the Soviet Union, the liberation of Minsk was not the end, but a gateway. With the German Fourth Army destroyed and Army Group Center fatally weakened, the Red Army now had an open road to Vilnius, Białystok, and Warsaw. The peak of the fighting at Minsk was therefore both a conclusion to one phase of Operation Bagration and the beginning of another, as the front shifted inexorably westward into the heart of Eastern Europe. After the fall of Minsk on 3 July 1944, the focus of operations shifted from urban combat to the vast encirclement that had formed west of the city. What followed was a brutal struggle of resistance and adaptation as the trapped German forces attempted to survive, regroup, and break out of the tightening Soviet ring. The Minsk pocket contained approximately 100,000 to 120,000 German soldiers from more than 20 divisions, along with thousands of vehicles, artillery pieces, and stragglers from shattered units. Though the fortress city itself had collapsed, these troops were determined to resist annihilation, hoping to fight their way west to rejoin the remnants of Army Group Center. German commanders inside the pocket improvised defensive lines in forests, marshes, and villages west of Minsk. Without sufficient fuel or heavy equipment, many units relied solely on infantry formations. Hastily organized Kampfgruppen, typically composed of a few hundred men drawn from various divisions, established strong points along roads and river crossings. Machine guns and mortars were placed in concealed positions, while officers attempted to instill discipline in troops who had been retreating for days under constant Soviet pressure. The strategy was to delay Soviet advances long enough for organized breakout attempts to succeed. The Red Army responded with systematic encirclement tactics. Soviet rifle divisions pushed steadily westward, supported by artillery barrages and armor. Mobile groups of cavalry and mechanized units patrolled the forests, cutting off small columns of retreating Germans before they could coalesce into larger formations. Air power played a decisive role. Soviet fighter bombers hunted German columns by day, attacking convoys, destroying horse-drawn wagons, and scattering soldiers who attempted to regroup. The 16th Air Army reported conducting thousands of sorties in the days following the city's capture, crippling German mobility and morale. Partisan forces also played a significant role. In the forests around Minsk, Belarusian partisans ambushed retreating columns, destroyed. Their intimate knowledge of the terrain gave the Soviets an advantage in locating hidden German positions. In some instances, partisans captured small groups of stragglers themselves and handed them over to the Red Army. For the encircled Germans, the countryside was as dangerous as the front line, with hostile locals and partisan units eliminating any chance of rest or resupply. The psychological toll on German troops was severe. Many had been fighting continuously since the launch of Operation Bagration on 22nd of June, retreating hundreds of kilometers under constant bombardment. Food supplies were exhausted, ammunition limited, and medical care non-existent. Accounts from captured officers describe men collapsing from exhaustion or deserting their units in small groups, attempting to slip westward through swamps and forests. Morale plummeted further when it became clear that no relief force was coming. Army Group Center had been shattered too thoroughly to mount a counteroffensive, and Hitler's orders to hold fortress cities had condemned their comrades to destruction. Despite these conditions, resistance remained fierce in many pockets. Soviet reports from 4th to 6 July describe engagements in which encircled German troops fought tenaciously, inflicting casualties before being overwhelmed. In some cases, entire companies refused to surrender even when surrounded, forcing the Soviets to destroy them with artillery and close-range assaults. A few German groups managed temporary breakthroughs, slipping west in small numbers, but these successes were rare and costly. The majority of troops were intercepted before they could escape. For civilians in the Minsk region, the aftermath was equally grim. The battlefields around the city were littered with corpses, wrecked vehicles, and burned villages. Villagers who had survived the occupation now faced hunger, displacement, and the danger of mines and unexploded ordnance. Soviet authorities organized emergency relief operations, distributing bread and attempting to restore basic services. At the same time, NKVD units began systematic sweeps to root out collaborators and secure order in newly liberated areas. The German attempts at adaptation in the pocket failed to alter the outcome. Without heavy weapons, fuel, or supplies, their capacity to resist dwindled each day. By 6th of July, the Soviet fronts had compressed the encirclement into a shrinking area west of Minsk. Thousands of prisoners were taken daily, including officers from several divisions. Columns of captured Germans, many starving and exhausted, marched east under guard, a visible testament to the scale of the Soviet victory. The resistance of German troops, their adaptation, breaking into small groups, fighting from forests, or launching desperate night marches, could not overcome the overwhelming Soviet superiority in numbers, coordination, and supply. Instead, it added to the growing casualty lists as tens of thousands were killed or captured in the final days of the encirclement. By mid-July, the pocket had been liquidated, leaving the Red Army free to continue its westward offensive. This phase of resistance and adaptation underscores both the determination of the encircled German soldiers and the futility of their efforts. Trapped by Soviet operational design, harassed by partisans, and starved of resources, their attempts to break free only accelerated their destruction. For the Soviets, the outcome confirmed the effectiveness of their encirclement doctrine and the maturity of their logistics and coordination. For the Germans, it marked the final collapse of organized resistance in central Belarus, sealing the fate of Army Group Center and opening the road to Poland and East Prussia. By 6th of July 1944, the encirclement west of Minsk had tightened into a killing ground. The once formidable Fourth Army and remnants of the Ninth Army, already shattered in earlier battles, now faced complete collapse. Soviet formations pressed inward from all sides, compressing the pocket into a shrinking area no more than 40 kilometers across. With every day, the trapped German forces were pushed into smaller sectors, their cohesion breaking down under relentless Soviet pressure. The turning point came as Soviet armored and mechanized corps cut the last trails and forest paths that German troops were using to slip westward. Cavalry mechanized groups moved rapidly along the Minsk-Molodechno and Minsk-Baranovichi axes, severing escape corridors. Infantry divisions then followed, clearing woods and villages systematically, destroying or capturing German detachments. Soviet air power ensured that daytime movement was nearly impossible. Bombing raids struck concentrations of troops, while fighter bombers patrolled roads, attacking even small groups of vehicles or marching soldiers. German attempts to stage organized breakouts collapsed. Orders from surviving staff officers urged units to fight toward Molodechno or Stolpci, but coordination was lost. Columns of hundreds, sometimes thousands, set out at night through forests, only to be intercepted by Soviet patrols or ambushed by partisans. Few made it through. The 12th Infantry Division, for example, tried to break out in battalion groups, but was encircled again and destroyed by Soviet tank brigades near Rakov. Similar fates met other divisions, leaving only scattered survivors to continue westward on foot. Casualties mounted on an extraordinary scale. Soviet estimates claim that between 4 and 9 July, nearly 70,000 German soldiers were captured in the Minsk pocket, along with 150 tanks and assault guns, 2,000 artillery pieces, and thousands of trucks and wagons. Another 30,000, 40,000 were killed during the fighting, often in desperate last stands or failed breakouts. Prisoner columns stretched for kilometers along roads leading east, guarded by Soviet riflemen and cavalry. Contemporary photographs show lines of exhausted, disarmed soldiers trudging through the ruins of villages and across open fields, evidence of the scale of the encirclement's liquidation. For civilians caught inside the shrinking pocket, the consequences were devastating. Villages were destroyed in crossfire. Soviet authorities rushed to establish field kitchens and medical stations, while NKVD units began registering the population and securing areas once dominated by German occupation forces. By 8 July, Soviet command declared the pocket liquidated. The final organized resistance was crushed near Naliboki Forest, where a conglomeration of German troops attempted one last breakout. Surrounded by artillery and tanks, they were forced into surrender. Soviet reports list more than 57,000 prisoners taken in this action alone, among them several generals and senior officers. Only a small fraction of German soldiers managed to escape west in scattered groups, most without weapons or supplies, to join retreating formations in Lithuania and Poland. The turning point at Minsk thus concluded with the destruction of the core of Army Group Center. What had begun as a fortress defense transformed into one of the largest encirclements of the Second World War. For the Soviets, it marked the culmination of a meticulously planned operation, proving that they could not only achieve breakthroughs, but also carry out rapid exploitation and complete encirclement on a massive scale. For the Germans, it meant the loss of an entire strategic grouping, a blow from which their eastern front would never recover. With the liquidation of the Minsk pocket by 8 or 9 July 1944, combat operations in the sector gave way to the grim aftermath of one of the largest encirclements of the war. Soviet rifle divisions, tank brigades, and cavalry mechanized groups fanned out through forests and villages, rounding up stragglers and collecting abandoned equipment. Prisoner columns swelled daily. By mid-July, more than 100,000 German soldiers had been taken in and around Minsk, including 11 generals and hundreds of regimental and battalion commanders. Captured documents, maps, and communication. Retreat and surrender followed different patterns across the pocket. Some German units resisted until surrounded, only capitulating when their ammunition was exhausted. Others dissolved into small groups, attempting to slip through Soviet lines at night. Few succeeded. Those who did reach German positions in Lithuania or Poland often arrived without weapons, boots, or equipment, evidence of the desperation of their flight. The majority either died in the forests west of Minsk or fell into Soviet captivity. Contemporary Soviet reports speak of tens of thousands of corpses left unburied across the battlefields, a sign of how rapid and destructive the encirclement had been. For civilians in the region, the end of combat did not mean immediate safety. Entire villages had been burned by retreating German units, and fields were mined to delay Soviet advances. Survivors emerged from forests to find their homes destroyed and food supplies gone. In Minsk itself, the devastation was overwhelming. More than two-thirds of the city lay in ruins. Industrial plants were destroyed, and rail infrastructure was unusable. Soviet engineers began clearing rubble and mines immediately, while NKVD units imposed order, registering inhabitants and screening for collaborators. The humanitarian crisis was immense, with thousands lacking shelter or medical care. The consequences for the German military were catastrophic. The destruction of Army Group Center during Operation Bagration and the annihilation of its corps at Minsk cost the Wehrmacht more than 300,000 men killed, wounded, or captured in 3 weeks. The loss of so many divisions in Belarus meant that Germany no longer had a viable front line in the central sector. Attempts to form new defensive positions west of Minsk failed, as shattered formations could not. For the Soviets, the immediate aftermath was marked by rapid exploitation of their success. With Minsk secured, supply lines were reorganized through the ruined city, enabling the Red Army to push west toward Vilnius, Białystok, and the approaches to Warsaw. Soviet commanders emphasized the importance of maintaining momentum, ensuring that German forces had no time to establish a new defensive line. The collapse of German power in Belarus opened the gateway to Eastern Europe and shifted the strategic balance of the war decisively in favor of the Soviet Union. The Minsk Encirclement also highlighted the limitations of German doctrine and Hitler's rigid orders. The fortress policy, which demanded that cities like Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, Bobruisk, and Minsk be held to the last, had resulted in the destruction rather than preservation of divisions. The Wehrmacht's capacity to adapt had been strangled by the insistence on static defense, leaving its armies encircled and destroyed one after another. The aftermath of the encirclement was thus a dual reality: liberation for Belarus, but devastation for its people; annihilation for German forces, but triumph for the Red Army. Roads and forests west of Minsk were strewn with wreckage, tanks burned out, artillery abandoned, columns of wagons overturned, and prisoner camps overflowing. This image symbolized both the human and material cost of the battle and the irreversible collapse of German control in the central sector of the Eastern Front. The encirclement and destruction of German forces at Minsk in July 1944 left a profound legacy, both for the conduct of the war and for the memory of those who lived through it. In less than 3 weeks, the Red Army had advanced nearly 500 kilometers, destroyed more than 20 German divisions, and annihilated the core of Army Group Center. The capture of Minsk and the surrounding encirclement eliminated between 100,000 and 120,000 German soldiers as prisoners of war, with tens of thousands more killed or wounded. For the Wehrmacht, this was one of the most catastrophic defeats of the entire conflict, comparable in scale to Stalingrad. The long-term effects on the German Eastern Front were decisive. The destruction of Army Group Center opened a vast gap between Army Group North and Army Group North Ukraine. German forces could no longer mount a coherent defense in Belarus, and Soviet troops advanced rapidly into Lithuania, Latvia, and Poland. Within weeks, the Red Army reached the Vistula River, placing them at the threshold of German territory and threatening East Prussia. The battle for Minsk thus marked the transition from defensive crisis to irreversible retreat for the Wehrmacht. For the Soviet Union, the triumph carried immense political and symbolic weight. Minsk, occupied since June 1941, had served as a key administrative and logistical hub for German control in Belarus. Its liberation on 3 July was proclaimed a national victory, and Joseph Stalin declared it one of the most important achievements of the Red Army. The anniversary of Minsk's liberation would later be commemorated annually in Belarus as Independence Day, underscoring the enduring significance of the event. Propaganda celebrated not only the scale of German losses, but also the restoration of Soviet power over Belarusian lands. The human consequences were equally profound. Minsk and much of the surrounding region were left in ruins. 2/3 of the city had been destroyed by bombardment, demolitions, and fires during both occupation and liberation. Tens of thousands of civilians were dead, deported, or displaced, and survivors returned to homes that no longer existed. Soviet authorities immediately began reconstruction, but recovery would take years. At the same time, the NKVD documented mass graves, execution sites, and evidence of atrocities committed during the German occupation. These findings would later form part of the historical record of Nazi crimes in Belarus. In military history, the encirclement at Minsk became a classic example of Soviet deep operations theory in practice. The Red Army demonstrated its ability to integrate multiple fronts, combine mechanized breakthroughs with infantry and artillery, and exploit partisan activity to sever German communications. The success showed how far the Soviet military had evolved since 1941, when it struggled to coordinate large-scale offensives. By 1944, it was capable of executing operations that annihilated entire German armies within days. For Germany, the defeat underscored the consequences of strategic rigidity. Hitler's refusal to permit timely withdrawals, his insistence on defending fortress cities, and the overextension of Army Group Center doomed tens of thousands of soldiers. Survivors who escaped west described the battle as a disaster brought about not only by Soviet strength, but also by flawed German leadership. In the post-war years, German military memoirs often pointed to Minsk as proof of the fatal consequences of Hitler's direct interference in operations. The legacy of the battle also lives on in commemoration and historical debate. In Belarus, monuments honor both the Red Army and the civilian victims of the occupation. The liberation of Minsk is remembered as a defining moment of national survival and resistance. Among military historians, the encirclement is studied alongside Stalingrad and Korsun-Shevchenkovsky as one of the largest and most effective Soviet encirclements of the war. It is cited as a turning point that accelerated the collapse of German power in Eastern Europe and hastened the approach of Soviet armies to the borders of the Reich. Thus, the Battle of Minsk stands as both a military triumph and a humanitarian tragedy. It marked the destruction of one of Germany's most powerful army groups, the liberation of a major Soviet city, and the opening of the road to Warsaw and East Prussia. Yet it also left behind landscapes of devastation, ruined cities, and a civilian population scarred by years of occupation and weeks of brutal combat. The legacy of the encirclement at Minsk endures as a symbol of both the Red Army's operational mastery and the immense costs of total war.